Was war das?
Ja. Und dann machst du das nochmal nachfragen.
Okay.
Ja, Fragen.
Hört man uns in Kaiserslautern?
Ja, sehr gut.
Also es wäre ganz gut, wenn das vorher schon getestet wäre. So.
Wir haben gerade gefragt. Ist der Ton immer noch gut in Kaiserslautern?
Ja, also wir hören euch immer noch gut. Ich frage mal, ob wir das länger benutzen dürfen. Oh, das ist die falsche.
So. Dear Amy Thomas, here. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fourth lecture evening of our Architecture Tuesday series in the summer semester 2020-2024. I'm happy to welcome you despite the beautiful weather and the European Championship matches. And I think Britain is playing today here in Cologne, and Amy was in the in the train with the fans. Well, this summer semester, our lecture series will focus on the city and its current demographic and social issues, as well as the current environmental and climate crisis that we are facing. In doing so, we want to focus on discourses about the possibility of communal living in shared urban spaces, diversity, inclusion, probably, and care within society. Dr. Adria Daraban, professor of architecture theory and history at the University of Kaiserslautern, and research associate Frederik Schnee, stands beside me, have curated this series. In this cooperation event between the Department of Architecture at the University of Kaiserslautern and our faculty, we are organizing 3 evening events for each in Cologne and Kaiserslautern. And this one is the last one here in Cologne. Next 2 will be in Kaiserslautern, but we will have an evening also here and see this lecture live via Zoom. So if you like to, can join us here. A brief outline of the evening. Frederik will briefly say a few words on why we invited Amy here, and the reason. And afterwards, student Lisa Küper will introduce our guest. Lisa is part of the so-called collective, an association of students who support the organization of the series. So please use the discussion round after the lecture and ask Amy questions. That's why she's here. And now I wish you an inspiring evening.
Thank you, Lavinia. So why did we invite Amy Thomas for our lecture series, New Tools for Shared City? Well, her extensive research offers profound insights into the intersection of architecture, finance, and gender. And her works, such as The City in the City, the publication, or The Political Economy of Flexibility, explore the intricate relationships between urban space and the economic paradigms. So moreover, her analysis of corporate real estate through a feminist lens adds a critical dimension to our understanding of how architectural practice can shape inclusive and equitable urban environments. And her diverse and impactful scholarship makes a valuable contribution to our discourse, our architecture and urban discourse on creating shared and resilient urban spaces within our cities. So I'm more than happy to welcome her here in Cologne. I think it's her first time she comes to Cologne, so I'm very happy she's here. And we'll pass the microphone to Lisa Küper, who will tell you more about her work and her research done by Amy Thomas.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lisa Küper. I'm studying architecture in the second semester of my master's program, specializing in project management and real estate economics here at the University of Applied Science. Today, I'm very happy to introduce you to Dr. Amy Thomas, an associate professor specializing in architectural and cultural history at the esteemed Delft University of Technology's Department of Architecture. Amy Thomas' research develops into connections between design, social dynamics, and urban environments across various scales. She's notably recognized for her insightful contributions to the field, shown through her publication of The City in the City, Architecture and Change in London's Financial District, which explores the post-war transformation of London's financial hub. She's also a co-editor of the book Teaching Design for Values, Concepts, Tools, and Practices, highlighting her dedication to advancing architectural education and fostering critical discussions in the field. In recognition of her significant contributions, she was honored with the prestigious Veni Personal Grant from the Dutch Research Council in 2020. This grant supports a groundbreaking 3-year research project on gender inequality and workplace design from 2021 to 2024. Beyond her research pursuits, Amy Thomas is an advocate for equality, diversity, and inclusion in architectural education. She actively participates in international initiatives to promote these important values within the field. At TU Delft, she shares her expertise across various programs, including the Bachelor of Science and Master of Science Architecture programs and the Bellage Center for Advanced Studies. Amy Thomas holds a PhD in the history of architecture from Bartlett School of Architecture. Before her tenure at TU Delft, she was a Harper Schmidt postdoctoral fellow and collegiate assistant professor at the University of Chicago. I'm now looking forward to your lecture on the uncomfortable frontier of feminism and capitalism, gender and corporate real estate development in Britain. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you all for your attention. Enjoy the presentation.
Well, okay, I must behave and stand still. Can everyone hear me okay? Firstly, thank you so much to everyone for those really generous introductions. Lisa, that was really, yeah, very kind, and I was not expecting that, so I'm a little bit taken aback. But thank you also to Frederick and Sabina and also Adria for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here in Köln. Maybe not so happy to be here on the day that all of my countrymen are also visiting, but it's okay. At least we've got good weather. So, I've got to try and, hang on. How do I skip to the, it's good to start. Yeah, I just tried that. Okay, I just hit the arrow. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, now we're in. Thank you. Yes, sorry. Okay, so the title of my lecture today is At the Uncomfortable Frontier of Feminism and Capitalism, Gender and Commercial Real Estate in Britain. And what I want to do today is kind of give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the research I've been doing over the past few years, which is trying to offer a kind of counter history, if you like, of workplace design and commercial real estate, which centers the female subject in the conversation. And I'm going to talk about commercial real estate in really quite broad terms, partly as a kind of sector, so an urban phenomenon determining specific kinds of land use, but also in a very specific sense of a collection of spaces and buildings built on very specific pieces of land in which people work. And by the way, it isn't lost on me that this is a branch of architectural and urban history that is often considered to be deeply unsexy. But nonetheless, I think demonstrably the main commercial real estate in general is becoming a kind of main driving force of regeneration and renewal in cities today. So it does bear some scrutiny also in the historical perspective. Despite gains in the last few decades, it won't be any surprise to any of you that there is still a dramatic gender disparity in our built environment professions, including urban planning, architecture, landscape architecture, surveying, and real estate. Most architecture schools, for example, have around 50-50 representation of gender balance, but the percentage of registered architects in most European countries is somewhere between the 20 and 25% mark. So there's a great kind of rate of attrition, and this isn't just in architecture, this is just to give you one example. And of course, there's been a lot of conversations in the last years about why that is and what the culture breeds and where that attrition is actually coming from, why women leave the profession after leaving architecture school. And in commercial real estate, while the numbers of students isn't as high, there aren't as many female students working in commercial real estate, the number of women actually working in the sector is also very low. So yeah, it depends which division you're looking at. But for example, in real estate financial services, there's about 30% of participants in that market are women. Around about 14% are actually in C-suite jobs. Commercial real estate in the UK has one of the worst gender gaps of any profession. It's about twice the national average. So the gender gap pay gap is about 27%. So there are kind of real disparities. Now, of course, it's sometimes a bit uncomfortable to think about commercial real estate when we talk about urbanism, and particularly because of the fact that it's usually not acting with kind of social motives behind it, but rather tends to privilege profit. But as I've said, it's arguably very important actually for the production of cities. One could argue that the presence of real estate, of women in real estate, is crucial as it affects the design, the development, the management and operation of buildings, and therefore shapes the cities that we're living in. When women's lived experiences are excluded from these processes, or when men provide inadequate proxies for these experiences, the resulting environments can be unsupportive at best and exclusionary at worst. And it's, I think, one of the indicators of how big its sway is, particularly in the UK, is the fact that the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, which is the main kind of educational route for people working in, the main accreditation route for people working in commercial real estate, is the oldest professional body concerned with land use in Britain, and it's much larger than any of the other societies, like the Royal Institute of British Architects or the Royal Town Planning Institute, for example. And so arguably has actually more influence than those bodies in itself. So there are obviously lots of authors from spheres of geography, planning and urbanism that have shown the importance of representation in the production of cities. And in their introduction to the book Fair Shared Cities, Inés Sánchez de Madariaga and Marian Roberts argue that representation is crucial in order that the built environment disciplines can better respond to gender-specific needs emerging in the world at present, including evolving and less predictable life cycles for both men and women, the reduction in birth rates, the diversification of household structures, including the increase of single person and female-headed households with children, the aging of the population with mostly female higher quintiles and mostly female population of caregivers, whether at home or in public or in private services, and the increasing racial and ethnic diversification of societies. And obviously I would add to that climate crisis too. So as a historian, I've been thinking about the production of real estate as part of a discourse on urbanism in the 20th century, mostly looking at the UK as my context. And today I thought I would try to explore the historical intersections between gender and real estate in Britain at two scales. First, at the scale of the sector and the city. So what role did women have in British real estate, and crucially, how did it change with bigger revolutions in British architecture and urbanism? And second, at the scale of the building. So I want to think here about what impact the various approaches to real estate development had on the women that use these buildings, And what interventions did these women make themselves? And specifically, I'm talking about offices. Of course, commercial real estate extends beyond offices into other non-residential forms of architecture too. So my interest in this subject came out of my book, The City in the City, Architecture and Change in London's Financial District. And this book, as has already been said, was looking at this very, very specific place in London. This is the centre of London, but it's also been home to London's financial and trade sector for a very long time. And I was looking at the city after the Second World War, when around 30% of its buildings were destroyed, and what happened after that. And so I was looking at this period in post-war Britain where many kind of conflicting ideas and ideologies were occurring at the same time. The welfare state on the one hand, but then this very slow and gradual deregulation of financial services. So I was trying to understand what big words like deregulation and neoliberalism actually meant in sort of bricks and mortar terms, what they meant on the ground. And I started to, in the final part of the book, I really start to look at offices and these interior worlds and how, I suppose in a more conventional sense, how kind of regulations, but also modes of production created a shift from a more kind of domestic office interior through to a kind of scientific management style of interior. And then looking at the kind of post-war modular construction and how that then tied into many of these ideas about production and continuing this kind of scientific management, and then into the networked office of the 1990s. And this book is I got towards the end and realized I'd written a very male-centered book. And it was only through looking at, this was a very patriarchal society. It still is, this area of London, the financial district and also the financial services industry generally is known for that. So it's perhaps not surprising that I focus very, very heavily on these kind of paternalistic and patriarchal spaces, as epitomized by this image of the London Stock Exchange at the turn of the century. And even sort of in the 1980s and even now, actually, how certain codified languages through materials and furniture and dress encapsulated specific kinds of masculinity and ideas about kinship and social structures in the financial district, so how design kind of mediated in a way these social interactions. The very end of the book, this last section at the very end of the book, I finally address the elephant in the room, all of these women that were working in the city at that moment. And it struck me that I really enjoyed writing this part of the book, and it struck me that actually it could be a very interesting project to really look into the role and the experiences that women had in the development of the modern office as we know it. And so this is where my next project came from, her office. And this is where I really wanted to kind of get into those ideas more. Of course, we kind of know this story already, that women are still massively underrepresented in financial services, but also in many other sectors, professional sectors. So the question was, okay, is the design of the workplace having any bearing on this? Is there any relationship between inequality, gender inequality, and space and design? And this was my sort of simple question, perhaps quite naive question, that I went into the project with. And initially I had decided to explore these 6 different social actions and how they manifested through design. So I was thinking about managing, for example. Management theory has always been a big determinant of how office spaces are designed. Desk working, women were mostly clerical workers in offices for most of the 20th century. I just wanted to think about their furniture and how that related to their bodies. Socializing, a big issue currently, well, continuing issue actually, with how certain kinds of workforce discrimination happens. Where does that happen? What does that look like? What did that look like? Using the toilet, we all know these debates very well. Arriving and leaving This was thinking about this division between work and home, which has been, you know, a constant source of interest for feminist scholars for a very long time. So how did that play out with the design of offices and their location in cities? And finally, designing. So thinking about the role that designers played and female designers in the design of the office. And of course, this is the idea, but the reality turned out to be something quite different. And I've sort of ended up kind of gathering on specific themes that have been particularly of interest. One is motherhood, and motherhood and office work seem to be completely incompatible ideas for most of history, and I'll come to that a bit later in the talk. And care work. So I've been thinking about sort of creches, for example, or the lack thereof, which were used as tools for biopolitical ends and withdrawn after the wars. Also breast pumping and breastfeeding spaces, like where did they come from, and how did women actually first manage to negotiate those two quite contradictory things, this very bodily maternal act, with actually being in this very sanitized, controlled environment. And there are, obviously, this is still an ongoing debate and question. So I've been also dealing with it in a contemporary context. Also thinking about design, health and well-being, and this is what I'll talk about a bit later in the talk, and how approaches, looking at different approaches to the female body, from ergonomics through to mental health, and how they were dealt with in the design of workspaces. But also in thinking about design and production in terms of interior design, but also in facilities management and in the kind of maintenance and caring of office spaces. So I've been also looking at cleaners and cleaning staff. And yeah, this is a great photograph of Florence Knoll, one of the very few named female office space designers, in a room full of all men, which is probably something she had to deal with quite often. But this is also something I haven't quite got to yet in the project, but it's something I'm looking forward to looking at possibly next year, the role that women actually played in the design of these spaces. Because although women had very prominent roles in interior design, they were actually very underrepresented in design of commercial office space. So it's sort of from this context that I'm going to now start discussing the issue of representation in commercial real estate. And just to prove that commercial real estate can be sexy, I'm starting with this photograph. In 1986, the pseudo-surrealist British photographer Brian Griffin was hired to photograph Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as part of a large-scale advertising campaign for a new office complex known as the Broadgate Estate, or Broadgate Complex, in London. Now, Griffin was a bit of a weird choice for this commission. He was an ardent Labour Party supporter, a member of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and he was known for his photography, largely of the excess of Thatcher's Britain, a style that he later dubbed capitalist realism. So it was quite a strange juxtaposition to have these two characters in the room. And Griffin has written about it, his kind of experience of it, quite extensively. And he said, I visited the toilet and I remember the fittings were gold. I enjoyed using the Prime Minister's loo. When he walked into the room, there was a table with a green cloth, which was arranged in the far left corner of the room, with 4 hard hats emblazoned with a big B for Broadgate on the front. 1 blue, 1 white, 1 red, and 1 chrome. Now, he was determined to get her to wear the white helmet to complement his black and white photography. But recognizing that, quote, she was the most powerful woman in the world at the time, who seemed to use her persuasive powers effectively, he resorted to manipulative techniques. After first choosing the predictable blue helmet, blue was the color of the Conservative Party, is the color of the Conservative Party, Griffin exclaimed, "Oh, Prime Minister, blue looks awful with your dress. Would you mind choosing an alternative hard hat?" Griffin knew she wouldn't choose the red one, as that was the color of the Labour Party, and chrome was, as he said, too bling. So As he thought and wanted, she chose the white one. Griffin then asked her to dance like Isadora Duncan, the famous American dancer who was strangled to death in 1927 by a scarf which got caught in the rear wheel of her open-top sports car. While waiting for a Polaroid test shot to develop, he turned his back on the Prime Minister. And he says, quickly realizing what I'd done, I turned back around to face her to discover she was like any normal person. The facade was not there. She had become the grocer's daughter from Grantham. So this kind of fable, this anecdote and photograph raises a couple of interesting points of departure that I would like to momentarily explore. The first is that the Prime Minister was posing for an advertising shot of an office building. And this is completely bizarre and completely unprecedented, as far as I know, in British history. And it acknowledged a kind of fundamental shift of the relations between the real estate sector and central government, and more broadly, the role of business and enterprise across all built environment sectors. The photograph was part of a bigger series by Brian Griffin, commissioned by the marketing agency Peter Davenport Associates for the developer Rosehor Stanhope. Another image from this collection of marketing material was published on the 27th of October in 1986 in the Financial Times, a captivating double-page photograph. A construction worker standing stoically looking out across a large building site, his back turned to the camera, his overalls and hard hat bathed in a luminescent glow, cast by spotlights beaming from the rubble and a large firework exploding overhead. The image is, of course, an advertisement for the Broadgate development, the largest, most innovative office complex in the City of London at that time. But for those in the know, the visual metaphor was also blatant. This was the day of the Big Bang, a financial revolution, the deregulation of the stock market, arguably Thatcher's most potent contribution to British economic policy during her tenure. And it heralded a new dawn in British finance and commercial real estate. The message was simple. Broadgate was a new kind of workplace developed by a new kind of developer for a new kind of financial district. And Broadgate really would have been unthinkable a decade earlier because it became arguably the most important architectural icon of Thatcher's reign, made possible by a transformation of UK finance and real estate sector that she ushered in. And this was part of what has become more broadly termed as the enterprise culture that she kind of ushered in. So opening up of global financial markets, an emphasis on the service economy, deindustrializing the north of England, and promoting global urban infrastructure like privatized telephone and internet companies. And this resulted in a kind of necessity for new kinds of office building. And Broadgate, this is another part of this series. This is also where the cover of my book comes from, The Big Tie, which is about a developer's tie being pulled into the model and then carried overhead like a royal bear into the center of the Broadgate circus. But this is a very particular and very new kind of office building in London because it was using American fast-track construction techniques. It was using American space planning standards, and even ultimately American architects in the last phases of it. SOM produced the second part. And it was designed to accommodate new kinds of information technology, essentially. With deregulation of financial services, Thatcher basically closed the stock exchange trading floor. So these companies were now trading in their own offices and needed large floor plates that could accommodate banks of desks of dealers, probably an image you're quite familiar with now in real estate terms. And this was, so generally speaking, a period in which the state was reconfiguring its relationship with the construction, design, and real estate industries to facilitate a vision for deindustrialization. And it was kind of building on public-private initiatives that had already been developed in the 1970s, where the Conservative, in its first term, the Conservative government developed a whole wave of new kind of planning instruments designed to directly engage developers rather than planners as the main drivers of new construction initiatives and to reduce the role played by local authorities. And so the goal of these bodies, if you like urban development corporations, for example, was to create attractive conditions for the real estate industry to encourage development, and in turn create a spin-off effect using property development to encourage more property development. So in other words, they were trying to stimulate enterprise rather than behave as tools for comprehensive planning. And these transformations made developers and surveyors and large-scale building contractors very, very powerful in the building industry in a way that they had never been before. And it gave rise really to a new breed of financially innovative and ambitious developer. And they became very, very profitable very quickly for various technical reasons in investment financing, which I won't get into. But it had a huge effect on the way that the building industry was run. So this is not the first picture of Thatcher in a hard hat, nor would it be the last, or of her fraternizing with developers. This is Thatcher at the Broadgate development using a bulldozer. This is her at Canary Wharf going up. She went up a crane. She was sort of known for these slightly daredevil stunts that she would do on building sites. This is her talking to the developer of Canary Wharf. This is her with the developers of Broadgate, Godfrey Bradman on the left and Stuart Lipton on the right. And so these photographs are kind of, on the one hand, a sign of the changing status of the real estate industry in Britain. Take the developers, for example. Stuart Lipton was an example of a new enlightened developer who became known for his close working relationships with high-profile architects, as well as his role in British public and cultural life. He became a member of the Royal Fine Art Commission and later became the chairman of the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment and was made an honorary fellow of the RIBA. This was a very rare honor for a developer whose profession was condemned 20 years earlier by the then RIBA president, Lionel Brett, for being made up of nothing more than opportunist intermediaries interfering between the makers and the users. So this is him there looking enlightened in his office. The second issue that I want to come back to with this photograph is that this photograph and all the others, Thatcher sort of inserts herself into the visual discourse of what was otherwise a very male-dominated industry. And so although she was no friend to the movement at all, in fact, she declared herself an anti-feminist, she was a kind of product of the women's liberation movement of the 70s. So the implementation of the Equal Pay Act in 1970, the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1975, and the Employment Protection Act of 1975 meant that more women than ever were entering into paid employment in the professional sphere. And census data shows that in 1981, 57.7% of British women were engaged in paid work, compared to 36.3% 30 years earlier. So there'd been a massive shift of women working. And although Thatcher did nothing to help the ascendancy of women through her policies, she kind of normalized success and became a model of the new professional woman. Appearing on building sites with developers, she was also offering a kind of specific form of feminist intervention into the real estate sector. And I'll come back to this apparent contradiction in terms in a minute. And in the mid-1980s, the range of professions involved in the real estate sector, so surveying, development, investment, and commercial architecture practices, for example, were highly patriarchal in their structure, their composition, and their operations. And in Clara Greed's landmark feminist evaluation of the surveying profession in Britain, she noted that in 1991, 5% of practicing surveyors were women. And this is significant since surveying comprises a range of specialist divisions, including real estate valuation, investment, transfer, development, and land management. And that the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors was the main route into the real estate industry. So although this number was low, it had risen from 0.5% at the end of the 1960s. So in just about 20 years, or 30 years, sorry, no, 20 years, yeah, it had risen dramatically. And this was just part of a kind of bigger rise in women in the professions, of course. But women were still not well distributed within the sector, mostly working within the kind of residential aspects of it. And British real estate, the industry had been formed from a highly nepotistic culture. From its early roots, property ownership in the UK was a professional monopoly that was designed to serve the landed interests of British society. So while upper class women in the UK played a significant role in landed societies, sometimes through inheritance, most of the time they were kind of passive financial vessels. There are two aspects of British common law that meant that women basically couldn't own property up until the end of the 19th century. So they were completely prohibited from engaging with commercial real estate. The other thing was that commercial real estate was run by these large dynasties that were passed down through male inheritance as well. So the trades of surveying were passed down from father to son, which was the ultimate exclusionary mechanism for women. And it wasn't really until 1919, with another legal change, the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, that women were actually allowed to enter into surveying. Now, of course, in sort of conventional histories of real estate, we might exclude women who had actively been doing what we would now consider, purchasing land, acquiring land, the kind of central tenets of real estate. For example, Henrietta Barnett, who had conceived the whole idea of the Hampstead Garden suburb, although her name usually gets left out of this this quite important utopian model development. So there are sort of several examples of women like this, and the real estate market evolved to kind of be involved with the St Pancras Housing Association. And she became the secretary of that society for 48 years. So she's somebody that did a huge amount actually socially from within this kind of context. But because she was considered a property manager, a housing property manager, she wasn't really considered to be part of the establishment in that way. So it would seem sort of fair to say then that the generation of women entering the profession in the 1980s were sort of pioneers of sorts, intervening where women before them could not. But Clara Greve has also shown that actually most of these women refused to be considered feminists or would not declare themselves as feminists. And that they would actually argue that they sort of arrived through hard work and they didn't want to be singled out as women, obviously a kind of a common trope. And sometimes these women called themselves bourgeois feminists, which was a non-derogatory term, which basically essentially meant a non-radical feminist. They weren't interested in necessarily reforming the real estate industry. They just wanted to participate in it as women in a very male-dominated industry. And Melissa Fisher, in her analysis of the first working women in Wall Street, terms this, she's also called this like market feminism, whereby the culture and structure of finance shape and constrain the thoughts and practices of those working there to the extent that they end up accepting and most often reproducing the dominant gendered, class, and race system of the marketplace. Ways of performing gender and whiteness, making profit without being made to do so entirely specifically. I've got a video here and I just don't know if it's going to play, but it doesn't actually need to. I'm not going to play it. Here she is at the Broadgate foundation ceremony. So she seemed to kind of epitomize this market feminist as she sat on this bulldozer, tentatively raising parts of Broad Street Station at the Broadgate foundation ceremony. And at this ceremony, she spoke of Broadgate as a testament to, quote, the virility and vitality of our times, metaphors of male potency abounding. She went on to say, a development that will maintain and enhance the reputation of the city as one of the world's greatest centres of trade and industry. There is a saying which I use quite frequently, that which thy fathers bequeathed thee, earn it anew, if thou wouldst possess it. It says almost everything. The task of our generation is to add our contribution with the same foresight, energy, vitality, and vigor as our forefathers provided to us. In 1977, the American feminist urban historian, Dolores Hayden, wrote a scathing critique of this kind of patriarchal approach to commercial real estate sector in the provocatively titled essay, Skyscraper Seduction, Skyscraper Rape. And she argued that, quote, as an instrument for enhancing land values and corporate eminence, the skyscraper consumes human lives, it lays waste to human settlements, and ultimately overpowers the urban economic activities which provided its original justification. And in a passage eerily close in sentiment to Thatcher's Broadgate speech, she quotes the architect Lewis Sullivan, praising the design of the a commercial building by H.H. Richardson. Here is a man for you to look at, a real man, a manly man, a virile force, an entire male, a monument to trade, to the organized commercial spirit, to the power and progress of the age, a male. It sings to the song of procreant power. She goes on, the architectural historian Vincent Scully carried this celebration of skyscrapers, money, and sex into the 1960s when he praised Rockefeller Center's public spaces as, quote, as if they were designed and used by people who knew what stable wealth was and were not ashamed to enjoy it. Flags snap, high heels tap, a little sex and aggression, the city's delights. All this seems to sort of somehow give some kind of perverse logic to the way that Thatcher presented herself in these images. As Greed writes, in the 1980s, there was a tendency to show women in hard hat roles in trade magazines to overemphasize the efforts that companies were going to implement equal opportunities best practice, arguing that this was probably because, quote, some men find that the macho women a turn on. Brian Griffin, the photographer himself, couldn't help but acknowledge this about Thatcher when he claimed that although she was 23 years older than him, he found her quite sexy. And let's get through that. So although Thatcher did her best to quash the feminist movement, paradoxically, it was in kind of counter-offense to her and her policies that the feminist urban planning and architecture movements experienced an ascendancy, particularly in London. Before this point, there had been very little feminist urban literature in Britain, and this rise was partly because of the creation of a very powerful and well-funded Greater London Council Women's Committee in 1982, one of the best-known experiments in municipal feminism. They were highly effective because they fundamentally reassessed the basis on which need was assessed in Britain, questioning the traditional nuclear family model on which everything from welfare payments to public transport, housing, public space design, and spatial planning were assumed. So they made big changes in planning through extensive consultations with women and surveys into matters across a whole issues on the kind of what's now called trip changing journeys that women were doing between between home, school, shopping, home, work, home. And so they kind of carried out these extensive surveys and reports that were highly influential actually in the planning of London. And they were also highly effective through large-scale funding that they did to feminist voluntary groups as well. Before they were shut down by the Conservative government in 1986, they gave 1,000 grants, of around £30 million, nearly half of which were for childcare projects, which had arguably been completely ignored in planning, particularly under the Conservative governments. So there was a kind of feminist culture in London that was expanded by other groups like the Women's Design Service, who were working in partnership with the Greater London Council to do gender-based urban research, and the perhaps more well-known Matrix Architecture Cooperative. So drawing on American writers like Dolores Hayden and Gwendolyn Wright, these groups were sort of trying to challenge the supposed naturalness of gender divisions in the production of the built environment, seeking to challenge the status quo. So they were critiquing things like the modernist zoning of the city that broke up residential and commercial architecture, this division of work and home. that was sort of antithetical to the ways that most women had to spend their day, but was lucrative for property companies because it prevented lower class land users from interfering with land values. They were also questioning things like public safety, public transport, private residential ownership, and the kind of patriarchy and elitism of the built environment professions. And they all were advocating for a more kind of inclusive and intersectional and participatory approach to urban and architectural design that was really, really very radical. And I think this book has been recently republished, I think for good reason, because people are interested in their ideas. And in the introduction to their book, their manifesto, they say, buildings do not control our lives. They reflect the dominant values in our society, political and architectural views, people's demands and the constraints of finance. But we can live in them in different ways from those originally intended. Buildings only affect us in so much as they contain ideas about women, about our proper place, about what is private and what is public activity, about which things should be kept separate and which things put together. So in a way, they were kind of advocating for a use value of buildings rather than an exchange value. And they worked on many issues and projects, like, for example, they were heavily focused on childcare, which had always been in very short supply. And they were also working very heavily in training women in craft, trying to kind of break down those divisions between construction and design. And they have a great website which shows the kind of range of projects that they were working on, but was also largely funded by the Greater London Council Women's Committee. So yes, their online archive is very good if you're interested in this. So to these groups, the kind of increased value of commercial real estate values versus residential showed a kind of societal priority of men's work. And this is a bit strange with regards to offices specifically, because women were actually the main office workers. Over half of office workers in Britain in 1984 were women. However, office development and its kind of associated infrastructure was only ever produced with male protagonists in mind. And oh yeah, this is just a postcard of theirs to show you how they kind of were very sort of irreverent and also playing around with representation in different ways. So as office buildings became more complicated with information technology and these kinds of things, there were also kind of shifts in the nature of office design and the rise of things like space planning. And one firm, DEGW, for example, was particularly influential in this domain. And they were known for bringing in sociologists, even anthropologists, data scientists, to really study the use of office buildings. And this document on the right, the Orbit study, was one of the most important reports that had ever been written, and most intensive and kind of truly observational readings of the office. And it talks all about the integration of technology, computers, which was something that women were most predominantly using in the office, but nowhere in the entire report does it make any reference to gender. And so there was a real kind of lack of awareness of the fact that actually women were making up the majority of the bodies in these buildings, but very, very little was being said about how and kind of why they were using the space. What time did we begin the lecture? I realized I didn't check that, so I don't know how much time I've got left. 1/4 past? Okay. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, good. So, how can we really understand the impact of commercial real estate without sort of knowing the impact it's having on people using it? And Leslie Köln, the feminist writer, has said, "What does my body allow me to write and speak? I could begin with my once pregnant body, sweating and nauseated on a North London train. I could begin with my tired shoulders aching from forcing a stroller through ice-choked Toronto streets. I could begin with my feet slipping gratefully out of my hot shoes into the cool grass of Hyde Park, where I lie back and people watch. This meeting point of bodies and cities is at the heart of asking women's questions and thinking about the feminist city. These questions ultimately have to help us imagine and enact different urban futures. So this idea of a kind of embodied experience of these places, I think, is also sort of crucial to really getting at the heart of how these dynamics played out at a smaller scale. And what I want to talk about now is particularly this question of well-being, women's well-being and health in the late 1970s and 1980s, at this moment when kind of Thatcher's discourse on real estate Thatcher was changing the discourse on real estate through all of her policies. So to start with, I think it's worth spelling this out very, very explicitly, that office design has never been a space of societal reform in the way that the home has, or even more broadly in urban design. So there's never been a moment in history where the office has been thought about as, okay, actually this could be, if in the way that modernists were thinking about homes, we could actually make a difference in people's lives by changing this. And so why was it overlooked from this perspective of societal well-being? Well, obviously, largely because it's in the hands of companies and private corporations, but also because of it, the nature of office work, and particularly feminized office work, had distinctly middle-class connotations, particularly in Britain. Clerical workers, female clerical workers, were often highly educated, having to speak in the 19th century a number of European languages, for example. So there was a kind of sense that, unlike factories, which had been where kind of working class bodies had been under scrutiny from middle class reformers, that actually the offices kind of escaped that perspective, that they were already seen as a good job, and they sort of relied in a way on a sense of visual propriety, the kind of nice trappings of an office, to kind of get away with paying women pretty much exactly the same as factory workers. So this is just to show you that there are many, many examples of crashes in factories, of kind of childcare facilities in factories, even like this quite hilarious one from the early 20th century. But there are almost no examples of crashes in offices. And this was also to do with the fact that women female officer workers were supposed to be productive and not reproductive. So women office workers were held back by the marriage bar. They were not allowed to work once they got married. And so up until about the late 1970s, 1980s, there were almost no women working in the office that had children. So this is also a very kind of interesting moment then, the 70s. And in there's a statistic I should just say, in 1968, the median earnings of women office machine operators, for example, were only 3% above those of semi-skilled factory machine operatives. So they were pretty much earning exactly the same, but it was these kind of attractive office environments that were supposed to make the job more desirable, even though actually probably the content of the work was quite similar. Alienation went hand in hand with feminization of office work. Women were introduced as typists and telegraphists in the 19th century and dominated these roles by the First World War. And with scientific management, the way the office was structured is very, very similar to a factory. So in this kind of what they call the straight line flow of work. And the idea was to organize the factory as a kind of assembly line. So whereas in the 19th century, the clerk had been quite an esteemed figure in the office and was a male profession, somebody who did everything. By the 20th century, this was a feminized occupation, and it had been completely stripped down to its most basic components. And so you see kind of scenes like this. On the left is actually a factory, on the right is an office, but it's very difficult to distinguish between them. Because of the marriage bar, the imposition of the marriage bar, this was a kind of way of making sure that women never ascended through the ranks in offices. So they always occupied the lowest rung of the kind of lowest paid roles, which meant they were also, because they were going to be leaving after a few years, they were never allowed any kind of pension provision or things like that. So they were incredibly kind of precarious, what we would say precarious workers today. Yeah, this is just, I just like this image. This is from a secretarial training college in the Netherlands. But you can see in a way how reductive the whole process was to actually being this incredibly bodily and kind of physical act, stripping away the kind of mental, cerebral idea of kind of what it was to work in an office. And you can see this kind of, I suppose, proletarianization of office work extended also into the 1970s when different kinds of visual display units came in, and women were kind of isolated in data centers where the work was very, very much like factory work. So in the office, women were classed as manual rather than cerebral workers. The British Civil Service, for example, describes the difference in their work class categories as an intellectual class, which was a small number of male university graduates, and the mechanical class, which was the rest, mostly women. And you can see this, for example, in also in the US, in the furniture arrangement. So women would occupy these large open spaces, and men would occupy the closed office spaces around the edge. And Daphne Spain, the sociologist, has called this distinction open floor versus closed door, a kind of distinction between thinking and doing. And I think you can also see this through furniture adverts, for example, where here the filing cabinet had literally disembodied arms and hands using these things, as if to kind of very, very literally point to women's mechanical kind of role. And in Britain at this time, in the 1970s, there were a range of different office types, mostly small, medium-sized, but there were a few kind of experiments in large-scale open-plan offices, which were obviously met with kind of trepidation and fear, as you see in this this article here. But in the historical material that I encountered, at least when looking at these office spaces, there was a sense that women were essentially powerless in these workspaces. The modernist office rationalized along a set of temporal and spatial norms or units that presupposed a predictable male-centered view of a worker, and had little kind of indication of understanding what a female body or female experience was like. Management documents were written by men, for example, and there was sort of little acknowledgement within archives that the idea of a woman's experience might be different. But in my work, I've actually revealed pockets of resistance. I've kind of come across these little pockets of resistance of women to women's groups, charities, and organizations that gave women the knowledge and tools to resist and take some agency within their work environments. So partly from the women's liberation movement in the 70s, the Hazards group, which I'll talk about in a minute, also through breastfeeding groups and breastfeeding advocacy groups, trying to kind of educate women on how to do this at work. And also due to kind of strikes and strike action, organized women's strike action, kind of taking control of their workplace in that way. And you start to see kind of engagement with a workplace environment in a very different sense to say how management planning literature would do it. So for me, this has been very kind of productive and interesting way to start centering a female body in terms of health and well-being, is actually looking through these small grassroots activist groups and what they were saying. As I've said, the 70s was, obviously a fascinating moment historically in terms of the women's liberation movement. And at this point, there was a huge influx of women into paid employment, and over a third of British women worked in secretarial and administrative positions, so substantially more than any other sector. And because of this, this also meant that more women who were married, more women with children or at different stages in their life cycle were actually working. So this was a new kind of office worker with much more complicated needs than had previously existed. They were no longer kind of young, single office worker. There were divorced women, pregnant women, the entire life range in the office. So it kind of threw up a whole load of new questions about office spaces and office design. Yeah, here's an example of kind of, say, one of the smaller style offices of these kind of typing pools. The Women in Work Hazards group is a group I came across who I think very interestingly sought to redefine who a working woman was, and to show what the contemporary work environment was completely neglecting their needs. And they were obviously also working at this moment when Thatcher had come into power. what I find kind of amazing about their work was firstly the way they created a kind of imagined female workforce as a collective, or they reimagined the female workforce as a collective. Their struggles weren't individualized, but made structural and society relevant. So kind of from the female perspective. And the second thing was that the way they conceived of the office building as absolutely integrated within the employee experience, their health and well-being and quality of life. So in the remaining time, I will quickly show you some of the things I found out about this group and sort of what they were doing. And I think this opening quote in their book, look around your office. Do people look well, or do you all feel tired at the end of the day, exhausted at the end of the week? Do you get headaches, sore throats, upset stomachs, rashes, backache? It's probably your job that's doing it. Offices are often tiring and stressful places to work and have their health hazards, physical, chemical, and emotional. And so I'm particularly interested in the way that they talked about the office environment through the lens of mental health and stress, and how this sort of politicized a broader conversation about user health and agency in the architectural discourse at the time. So this group was established in 1977, and they sort of set out to recenter women's health in the intertwined women's liberation and labor movements, and also to show that how occupational health was part of a wider social context. They were part of the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science. Now, this sounds very grand, but actually they were basically a bunch of hippies, and they were campaigning on major environmental issues, and they were producing this kind of work. But they tried to essentially make science more accessible, but also link kind of science and politics and bring it to people. And so the Women in Work Hazards group were part of a subset of this called the Hazards Movement, which was mostly focusing on environmental large-scale hazards. And they then realized that actually a lot of this conversation was really not dealing with the needs and issues of women at all. And so they formed their own smaller group. This was also at a moment when there was a kind of growth in awareness of occupational health and safety at work. And I have to say that that is much stronger here in Germany than it was in Britain. There was relatively little by the end of the 1970s on these issues. And through conferences and symposia, I've realized how much amazing work was actually being done here by feminist groups on occupational health and safety, which is very, very interesting. And there was a kind of a shift following the introduction of the Health and Safety at Work Act in 1974, which for the very first time enshrined the employer's responsibility of the general welfare of employees in law. So this was a group of women who basically had backgrounds in the trade unions, health and safety, law, social and medical sciences, and in the women's liberation movement. And they wanted to improve women's experience of the office. So they were initially using kind of typical women's liberation movement techniques like consciousness raising, providing free advice and literature about a wide range of hazards, collaborating with trade unions and women's centers and that kind of thing. They saw stress as the dominant health hazard, and it was a very helpful idea, this term stress, because it served to encapsulate this kind of whole multiplicity of grievances characterizing the female experience at work. So this might relate to the social environment, which was, for example, the ongoing struggle with care and housework responsibilities, the repetitive and unstimulating nature of the work, unrelenting sexual harassment and discrimination, and in the case of cleaners, many of whom were migrant workers, racism, or in the physical environment, which was exposure to, potentially harmful toxins from photocopiers, carpets, and cleaning fluids, even correcting fluid, repetitive strain from typing and eye problems, and potential reproductive problem from new technologies like visual display units. And so through this kind of conversation about stress, the office became a hostile environment with real physiological effects on health, colds, anxiety, depression, heart disease. The office became a kind of objective scrutiny in pamphlets and articles. And it seems to me that this was not just a British movement, but actually an international movement. Michelle Murphy has drawn attention to the 9-to-5 movement in America, for example, which was very similar. And I've also come across other things in Scandinavia and France. In the UK, this was very neatly tied to the labour movement as well. with a kind of intertwined socialism, gender and class struggles. And stress was a kind of very nebulous and difficult to pin down term, essentially, and previously had been kind of explicitly tied to only to executives. So it was known as the kind of boss's disease in a way. And suddenly new kinds of ideas about stress from Scandinavia in particular, but also through a very important social epidemiological study in Britain, basically reversed that idea and showed that actually the lower grade employees were roughly 30% more likely to die of heart disease than those in higher grades. And it completely sort of flipped the idea that stress was somehow some kind of elite disease and made it more kind of closely linked to class and other intersectional ideas. And so the Women in Work Hazards Group adopted these ideas and kind of encouraged people to join a union, hire a health and safety representative, and to organize themselves internally, politically as well. So on the surface, the physical changes that they were suggesting to the office weren't actually too different from those that women's health and safety organizers had argued for at the beginning of the 20th century. They said, you may be able to organize proper lunchrooms or put pressure on management to provide a rest room to relax in. Other possibilities were better canteens, more comfortable furniture, and negotiating temperature and noise level adjustments and ventilation. But the main difference here, and this is probably what I want to stress, was that they were giving women agency in the process, surveys and organizing. In the domestic sphere and in housing, women had been involved in the transformations given and that had given more women control over their spaces. And this was not so in the office. Historically, design interventions to help, this is one of the surveys that they were using. But historically, design interventions in the office to help female clerks had been top down. Women were considered as manual workers and subjects of experiments in furniture, lighting, to facilitate productivity rather than well-being. And maybe some of you know these images, but these are the motion studies where they attach light bulbs to clerical workers' hands to see how many movements they did to try and reduce them. And so before stress, ideas like fatigue were the big challenge that linked behavioral and psychology with the built environment. But they were really just about improving women's productivity and not actually helping them. And this was kind of shown through the kinds of furniture that women were made to sit at, and this kind of tiering of space standards, and the kind of the way that sort of male thinking space were furnished with all the psychological comforts of home, whereas women were kind of mechanical. Now I probably need to do things up here. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, a few minutes, yeah. And I think what's interesting here, and this is something I won't go into now, but from a health and safety perspective, what was sort of critical was that women's bodies had essentially been completely omitted from any kind of studies of occupational health and safety. And any protective legislation that did exist only existed to protect the fetus, the unborn child in a woman's body, rather than her body itself. And so this is kind of also the really radical act that this group were doing, was to actually center women and their experiences, their social experiences, and their bodies as kind of critical to these changes. And so the Women in Work Hazards Group tapped into two critical notions that would underpin office design theory in the coming decades. One was that mental and physical well-being at work was connected to employee perceptions of freedom and control. And the other was that well-being at work was determined by an employee's wider social environment. And these kinds of ideas came through in the kind of whole sick building syndrome epidemic, which was very, very gendered as a conversation, despite the fact that office buildings were becoming much higher in quality with higher standards. There was an argument that actually the experiences of people within them were much lower. So computers, being in these air-conditioned spaces all day. And so these conversations became much more prominent, particularly around women and computer usage. I'll just skip forward. So the point I want to make is that actually the whole conversations around well-being particularly in office design, have really been centered around the kind of whole idea of leisure and sort of having a nice time at work, and often with counterproductive means to try and actually get people to stay at work longer. You know, there are more facilities and things like that offered, like in the Google campuses and so forth. And now stress is really talked about, often being located with the woman herself, for example. So this kind of idea of spillover between work and home is often a term that gets used. So women are kind of carrying that rather than large-scale institutions or sort of structural things. And we see all these kinds of fixes, design fixes that are supposed to improve people's well-being, like this very unappealing calm meditation space that is kind of like a phone box. But yeah, and you see this also with breast pumping pods and these kinds of things that, you know, they're really they probably more visibly than anything else how unstructural and kind of how undeep rooted these fixes are. And what I think that we can learn from these kind of groups, these activist groups, is the way that they actually use kind of, yeah, maybe more traditional feminine ideas like care as a way of actually structuring the way they talk about environments, and they talk about commercial estate and design. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. So thank you very much, Thomas, for this very intriguing lecture in a very specific moment in time and a context which is very specific to London in Britain, which I would say probably most people are not really familiar with, including me, of course. And I would say it's a bit disappointing that students are missing right now, because I think we can listen, we can learn about such urgent issues which are concerning every one of us. And so I hope this is going to get better in the next lectures, so students should come. So to get back to the lecture. So the Big Bang, as you said, the deregulation of the stock exchange, the stock market had a major impact on the building industry and the real estate. And so it's a massive shift in favor of women employment, but it's understood only for a small portion of women, in particular upper class women, I would say. So that's kind of the narrative that Margaret Thatcher would have liked. But you also actually display that the other protagonists, women earlier, pushed into and initiated this shift. So you call them kind of pockets of resistance, claiming agency. And so I can only agree with this importance and impact of women being excluded and overlooked, mostly in the production of space and design. So yeah, so we have quite a mess. So that's my constitution. And it's wrong, it's documented. When we see a lot of applications, so there's been work done, it's exposed, but that means we need to reimagine the tools to make it right. So I will just start with the first question. So how can we how can contemporary urban design and corporate real estate development be reimagined to promote greater gender equity and inclusivity in financial centers, in particular one not in London, but I would say in general in Europe or globally maybe. So what can we do? Do you have any?
Well, don't ask a historian. I mean, well, I think representation is obviously very, very important. So it's getting women into the positions where they can actually make an impact and also draw on their own experiences. I think that's critical. I think when you look at the way that the planning and real estate sector in Britain, and particularly in the City of London, is organized, it doesn't lend itself in any way to any kind of social reform, because it's highly, highly fixed on land values and profit, and particularly in the City of London, which is essentially run by businesses. So the Planning and Transportation Committee in the City of London has 30 business representatives on it as comprising the committee. So they are always only going to ever speak in favor of their interests, of business interests. And that's what, in a way, makes these places very difficult to actually reform, I would say. So, yeah, I think it's a very big question. I think, you know, the books I showed at the beginning, they start to suggest alternative models for that. Particularly this issue of, you know, use value rather than exchange value as being a kind of ideal behind things. Also care, you know, bringing in some of these kind of concepts that are maybe more germane to a feminist conversation, but into that world where we're thinking beyond the profit motive, but actually more into kind of not just ticking the corporate social responsibility box, but actually kind of thinking about communities as a whole. I mean, the finance district is a very homogenized community. It is just that. It has 12,000 residents and it has 500,000 daytime population. So, you know, they are always going to win actually in that context. Yeah.
So it's not easy to break this.
No, sorry, not a very optimistic message.
Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. That was amazing. It's really exceptional, and I definitely learned a lot. I actually have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is about part two, where you're talking about the typists, particularly being women and their role in the workplace and how that looked at the factory. I'd be interested to know, in your research, did you find anything about like an architectural office and what that looked like from a woman's perspective, and what that a gender perspective kind of looked like?
Yeah, I haven't done that work, but I know people that have. And I think, you know, there are many things that are similar in the sense of women being given low grade jobs and, you know, tracing and sketch, those kinds of the kind of manual jobs earlier on were predominantly given to women. And I think there were also these issues of women not being able to run their own companies, also the marriage bar, kind of having a long cultural legacy in architectural offices too. So I think it's there. I think probably the difference is that women who were working in offices were not educated to the same degree as, say, an architect, a female architect would be, that had actually kind of made it to that level. So they're architects, they're dealing with a whole different set of kind of cultural barriers going into the profession than female clerk typists or machine operators.
My second question is actually about part one. You were referencing some work by Clara and Reed, and I just want to check, what was that particular book that you were referencing?
It's called Surveying Sisters, and it's basically a history of the British surveying industry. So the kind of route into commercial real estate. But it's very thorough. But she was doing it in the study, I think, was done in the late 70s into the 80s, and it was published in 91.
She's the same author that also writes a lot on public thoughts.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the structure, and you said, or showed the pictures at the beginning of the women that were not included in the planning of the city. That you show about the staircases and the trolleys that the women were carrying. And I just asked myself, is it really fair to look at the city at this point, at this time, because when the city was planned, it was way before the trolleys were even that much used. And also you showed how the women were included in the city, in the working field, for where you said, for example, in the beginning, they were almost not there at all. And when they started really working in the office, they were not married, so they had no children. So they wouldn't even go to London, maybe with their trolleys. They wouldn't have to. They would maybe just walk in their neighborhood in the park, even if they would have one. And just later on, when the city was already maybe done, and it was in to have a trolley, maybe the city was done by then, you know, and then to react, it's maybe not so, it's not maybe not possible to react that fast.
Well, I think these photographs were from, I think the photographs, there's one from the Greater London Council Women's Committee and one from Matrix, the book on Matrix. Yeah, and this seems to be a kind of common image they use. I think it's an image that basically very, very literally shows women struggling with the built environment. But of course, you know, most of those spaces that they were in had been designed within the last 20 years. You know, they're brutalist staircases, for example. So I think it's very fair that they should have been designed, that they should also think about women's movements right in the city, because women have lived in London for generations, and it's not the first time they're using a stroller. So I think you know, the argument was that women's movements throughout the city just had not been considered at all in the planning, in the way of kind of uses and things like that were spatialized in the urban environment. I think that's what they were trying to get at with those photographs.
Yeah.
More questions? I will. So maybe we have a question about architectural education, and this is from the faculty, we also teaching and feel out. So how can we initiate, how can we activate or participate in some kind of engagement? So how can this be transmitted to students to do something about the environment? Because it's what you're showing is an office space. So any workspace changes, but still, I mean, everybody's gonna go out of the school, they're gonna go work something in architectural practices. I mean, if you look at architectural practices, right now there's lots of issues. I mean, discrimination, etc. What do we do with architectural schools?
Yeah, well, I think it's also a big question about who is actually designing office spaces, because often they're not really designed. They're kind of led by furniture manufacturers. But there's also, yeah, so there are architecture practices that specialize in workplaces. There are also real estate firms that have very specific divisions that deal with workplace design and workplace consultancy. So you have to come at it from different disciplinary perspectives, I think. And part of that is, you know, for example, I gave a lecture recently to the management and the built environment students studying commercial real estate. And I think that they just never get any kind of lecture from a historical context anyway, but let alone with the kind of specific subjectivity of gender or race or something, looking at what they're doing. So I think it's like very, very different, the kind of education that these students are actually getting. And yeah, I think it's possibly about bringing that kind of cultural historical awareness in that can help. I mean, obviously there are lots of bigger issues within architecture schools that go beyond simply learning about how, you know, what a kind of good workplace looks like. I think firstly, you have to start by making the architecture school a good, healthy and inclusive workplace to start with, and then build up from there.
Also the developers. I mean, I know that since there was a fire, the people, the faculty, I now heard about that. I mean, they democratize the working space, and I don't know, maybe can experience.
Democratized, yeah, definitely not. It's well, it's the neoliberal urban university campus par excellence. We don't have offices. We have co-working spaces, and we don't have shelves for our books. We have. I could go on. I could start ranting about this now, but I won't. I mean, I think that the thing at our technical university is that the idea of innovation seems to trump all other kinds of more reflective practice. And so the idea is that about producing these kind of co-working hubs. Even the library, for example, has no quiet spaces really to sit in. So I think there's also maybe a certain technocratic idea of what good design is and how it links to innovation, and by extension, how it links to the economy in a certain way that could maybe be revised and rethought of. I mean, the students, we also don't have enough studio space, so I think that's also always going to be an issue, right? In this kind of space, in an architecture school that trains half of the country's architects.
So I know about the form of system that consists of a model line. There are lots of hundreds, I would say, short field. So it's maybe fewer 60 or 70.
Yeah, there was a big women's studies group in Delft in the 70s that were really influential and interesting. And some colleagues of mine have looked at their archives specifically and the work they were doing.
So there is sometimes like maybe it's overlooked and we should still be marginal, but we have identified those.
I thought you were asking me about the workplace. That's why I started talking about that. But in terms of feminism and in TU Delft, yeah, there are definitely many more of my colleagues now working on this subject, and certain issues, that we have raised have definitely been started to be addressed in terms of the culture and also in terms of representation. So yeah, I think it's moving forward.
Question in the Zoom chat. Yes, that's the question. So yeah, I think we're at the end of the. Any more questions? So, thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting lecture, and something I have some things to know and that were. But it's how this is something that people can take home, and we should do more students. I think that's thank you.
Thank you.